he remembered, he grew up among, he was born around the turn of the century in Michigan, and he grew up surrounded by veterans of the Civil War, Union veterans of the Civil War. And he and his pals viewed them as a sort of heroic generation who had actually been at the places that were so famous to those young boys. They'd been at Shiloh, they'd been at Gettysburg, they'd been at Chickamauga and at Chancellorsville. There they were, Cold Harbor. They had actually been there, and they simply occupied a distinct and very much admired position during his boyhood in Michigan. And I think that as he got older, he made his career as a journalist for the most part. I think, as almost all of our listeners probably know, when he did begin to return to the Civil War, he did so centered on those veterans. It was the veterans that brought him back, the common soldiers of the Civil War, who really exerted the pull on Catton toward the mid-19th century. And he had that tangible tie to the war through those veterans. He was close to the war. When he was writing, there was really only one historian who'd written seriously about common soldiers, and that was Bell Wiley, who'd written a book called The Life of Johnny Reb that came out in the mid-1940s. And after Catton, he would publish The Life of Billy Yank on Union soldiers. He is generally acknowledged as the pioneer in common soldier studies. I would complicate that by saying Bruce Catton really should get credit for being at least the co-anticipator of that part of the field, because Catton did exactly the same thing in these books, writing from the ranks, looking outward and upward, only he reached far more readers than Bell Wiley did. So in terms of really influencing people to come at the war instead of from a top-down way, most of the literature before Catton had dealt with high politics or with great commanders and their military campaigns with some attention to diplomacy and so forth, all from the top down. Catton really changed that frame of reference from one down, from the command into the ranks, from one in the ranks outward and up. There are surprises in them. I mean, when I came back to edit these, I hadn't read them in a long time. A long time. And I came back to them, and there were several surprises for me. And one was that my boyhood sense of them was that they're pretty much a lot of stuff about battles and action in them. There actually isn't that much about battles and action in them. I mean, the battles are there. They're set piece descriptions that he has, but he does a great deal more in these books than they're not just a military narrative. They are much, much more than that. And it's not strict chronology. He doesn't begin with the beginning of the story in Mr. Lincoln's Army. He begins with John Pope and the campaign of Second Bull Run in Mr. Lincoln's Army. And then he drops back and brings McClellan on the scene and so forth. There were a number of surprises. He also does surprising things with key moments. There, at the end of A Stillness at Appomattox, there you are at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. And here comes Grant in his little cavalcade riding toward the McLean house. And you think, okay, now he's going to take us in. He doesn't take us into the McLean house. You're with the common soldiers. You see Grant ride by. That's the end of that. And then the band strike up Old Lang Syne. I mean, what a way to end that book. Completely unexpected.
And by the way, nobody feels cheated or felt cheated by that.
No. Well, this does the same thing with Lincoln at Gettysburg. He sets the stage, and then he says, the tall man, I'll just paraphrase, stood up. He has 2 pages of notes in his hands, and he began to speak. That's the end of the volume. Not a word from the Gettysburg Address.
And it works.
It works. It works beautifully. When he wants to do a set piece on a battlefield, he's just, one of my favorites is how he brings the Iron Brigade onto the scene of battle on July the 1st, 1863. Talks a lot about the Iron Brigade. The Iron Brigade forms a sort of leitmotif through the book because it's an all-Western regiment, Western in Civil War. That is Wisconsin and Indiana and Michigan. There's one regiment from Michigan there. And they wore distinctive hats, and they're the most famous brigade in the Army, and they're the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Army Corps. So, and he has them going toward that, how they thought if the army were ever drawn up in one long line, they would come first. But as he brings them onto the field, he just paints this picture. He pulls readers into what they can see and what they can hear. He talks about the music that the bands start to play, and how to the west they can hear the battle developing, and a soiled cloud of musket smoke drifts up. And he talks about how the bands are playing. They're probably playing "The Girl I Left Behind Me," the perennial theme song, he calls it, of the Army of the Potomac. And then he finishes by saying, playing the Iron Brigade into its last great fight. Well, what we learn later in the chapter is there are 1,800 men in the Iron Brigade when they wake up on the morning of July 1st, and 1,200 of them become casualties that day. It's the end of the Iron Brigade as a great unit in the Army of the Potomac. The way he brings the Iron Brigade onto that field is just amazing to me. Every time I read it, it just is it's a powerful, powerful passage. He also says in these books, and I hadn't remembered this either, that the Civil War isn't really primarily a military event. It's primarily a political event. It's a political event that is resolved through military means. And part of that political event is the question of emancipation. He talks about emancipation. He talks about attitudes toward Black people and emancipation on the part of the soldiers in the ranks and others. He really does much more of that than I think most military history at the time would have done. So he anticipates that change in the literature as well. He talks about what we would now call the dark turn. He talks about cowardice. He talks about plundering. He uses the Battle of Fredericksburg really to talk about how this war had changed from 1861 to December 1862, and how it has reached a point where you really hate the other side, and where you think anything you do to the other side is all right because the other side has proved to be so vile. He does a lot of things that are sort of surprising for someone who was writing 65 years ago. The Civil War really exploded in the 80s and then through the 90s for a variety of reasons. Ken Burns was part of that. Jim McPherson's Battle of Freedom was part of that. There were the 125th anniversaries. What else gets remembered on its 125th anniversary? I don't even think there's a word for that. All of those, I think, were heavily dependent on people who had been, at least to a degree, shaped by Catton in the 1950s and 1960s. Stephen Sears wrote at one point that he thought all of the talk about the explosion, Ken Burns, and all the other things about the Civil War in the 90s, Catton is lurking in the background as one of the preconditions, I would say, for much of what happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Explosion of the whole battlefield preservation movement